and welcome everyone to our fourth panel session of the week and the final session on the third day of the conference. My name is Danielle. I'm a researcher with National Energy Action, UK Fuel Poverty Charity, and I am one of the trustees of the Fuel Poverty Research Network. As other panel chairs have noted, this session is part of a week of events under the banner Making Decarbonisation Fair. It's been run by the Fuel Poverty Research Network, Engage at Energy Poverty Action, DECO, and the Centre for Environmental and Sustainability Research. The panel discussion this afternoon will look at approaches to working with communities and with vulnerable people to address energy poverty. And we've got a great lineup of speakers as part of our panel today. On day one, we focused on Portugal. We then zoomed out to Europe in the morning yesterday, and then we considered the global perspectives in the afternoon. This session is going to zoom back in. We're going to draw more of a focus to local action and local actors. We'll examine how participation, ownership and empowerment can all help to give people greater agency and a stronger voice in shaping a just transition to a decarbonised energy system. The session will last between 60 and 90 minutes, and in it we will hear from 5 speakers across 4 projects and programmes of work. This includes Irene, who's given a presentation alongside Laura, exploring the impacts of energy poverty on children in Barcelona. Jez Hall from Shared Future CIC in the UK, discussing how you can work with communities in the just transition, focusing on citizens' juries and participatory budgeting. I first came across Jez's work on the Reasons to Be Cheerful podcast, so I'm quite interested to learn a little bit more about that work today. We'll then hear from Lauren and Shane from Changeworks in Scotland or the UK, considering the impacts of decarbonisation and mechanisms of achieving and ensuring consumer protection in this transition. And lastly, we will hear from Marine Cornelis discussing the ESRC Just Energy project, which spans 6 European countries and focused on the process of accessing justice through ADR and the role of the Ombudsman. Each panellist has prepared a presentation, and I want to thank you all for in this session for taking the time to put these together. They provide some excellent insight into the work that you're doing, and they are not a quick or easy thing to do, despite us being somewhat used to this way of working now through and on screens. I'm sure that those of you who've watched the presentations, like myself, will agree on the quality of speakers in this and the other sessions, and I'd highly recommend visiting the conference video library to watch these and the other presentations as and when you get time. So as the other chairs will have noted, just a bit on structure of the session. So I'm going to invite each of our panellists to introduce their research or programme of work, and then we'll have a discussion across the panel around the theme, across some cross-cutting themes and a number of specific parts of maybe your presentations and the discussion. We're keen to involve those in the panel and those watching today in the discussion, especially having such a diverse and international group in attendance this week. So as with the other sessions, we'd ask you to use the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen in Hoover, or the Q&A function in Zoom if you're in Zoom, and we'll be drawing on these throughout the session, so please do keep them coming throughout. If you have more general comments about the chat today, you can use the chat function on Hoover on the right-hand side of your screen, but if you can pop the questions, more specific questions in the Q&A box. And feel free to tweet and share. I know that I've got colleagues who will be tweeting about the session on social media, so please do use the hashtag #MakingDecarb there. So first up today, we're going to hear from Irene Gonzalez-Pijuan, who is a PhD candidate at Sheffield Hallam University and who has spent 10 years working in activist engagement in the fight against energy poverty. Irene is a member of the Alliance Against Energy Poverty, which has developed successful advocacy processes from affected families and has woven a collective struggle for a new energy model. Irene has participated in the drafting of several reports, I'm sure we'll hear about a couple today, on energy poverty and gender and on the impacts of energy precariousness on children and adolescents. And I'm going to hand over to Irene. Thank you.
Hi, I'm very happy to be here. I will try to make it on time for the short presentation. May I still share my screen so it might be easier? So can you see it?
We can, yeah. You're good to go, Irene.
Okay, I'll try to put it in a presentation. Okay, then here, unfortunately, Laura was unable to make it, so I'll try to speak for both of us. We did like 2 different reports of publications on the impacts of energy poverty and children. One of them is a report for an NGO called Engineers Without Borders, and also for the Alliance Against Energy Poverty. And another one, it's an article that it's now being reviewed in a project from the Public Health Agency in Barcelona. We have seen, like, our starting point has been like there is some literature in the studying like the association between energy poverty and mental or physical health outcomes in children and young people, even though like less attention has been paid to the mental health impacts, and even less attention has been paid to education and security in terms of this association between the lack of enough energy and childhood. We have been both publication has been done like with different data. We have been used like existing evidence and data as the Barcelona Health Survey, but also we have conducted like interviews with families in the Alliance Against Energy Poverty, and we have collected a lot of information in the collective assemblies that the Alliance Against Energy Poverty does every 2 weeks. In terms, I will try to be quick. I think that has surprised us, and it's very important, is that more and more families, at least in Barcelona, have irregular connections, and that entails a very high risk in terms of security, like for fires or electrocutions. And we have seen also that it's this strong need of energy services in daily lives of children. So families always seek the way to provide these energy services, even if they are unsafe. I'm sure you've heard about La Cañada Real in Madrid, where like almost like 2,000 children are lacking any energy supply from October 2020. And there has been lots of intoxications because families like try to use alternative methods because they need those energy services, and they put in a high risk their health. And so I will try to go to the conclusions so that I'll stick on time. We have seen like there is like almost between 10 and 15% of children living in energy poverty in Barcelona. So it's very high, and there's a lot of geographical inequalities, and also inequalities by socio-demographic, socioeconomic, and socioeconomic conditions. There is specific impacts. We have seen them like in both dimensions that I exposed at the beginning, but less attention has been given, and it's important because it's a gap in research, like to live the experience of children and to make up or address like meaningful policy and practice to address energy poverty in children, and to give children a voice and agency in all this process, because as a vulnerable group, highly affected by energy poverty in most of European countries, they lack this agency, and they are not considered like political subjects in the energy poverty fight or process, and that's very important to be done. And it's also important to consider that all the impacts of the pandemic into daily like economics of families, it's very important and has to be considered also, because it's gonna be worse like this year and the following ones. And I think I tried to manage the times.
Irene, thank you very much for that. Like I said, we've got quite a meaty discussion session following, so it would be brilliant to hear more about the case study of La Cañada Real, which is a particularly harrowing example right now, and I wasn't aware of it before your presentation. And also some sort of interesting points around reflections on workshops with school children and the inclusion of young people's voices and experiences is more generally. So we may well come back to that in a little bit when we have the discussion, but thank you very much, Irene.
Thank you.
Next up, we'll hear from Jez Hall. Jez is a community activist living in Manchester, so not too far from myself in the UK, and he co-founded Shared Future CHC in 2009. Shared Future facilitate deliberative processes, mainly on the topic of climate change. Jez also specialises in participatory budgeting, which is being increasingly considered as a part of any just transition or Green New Deal, as a way to direct public investment, democratise decision-making and mobilise citizen-led action. Des sometimes works as a consultant for the World Bank and doesn't think enough progress has been made on climate change since his days studying economics back in the 1980s, something which he may well discuss more along with the work of Shared Future in this session. I'll hand over to you, Des. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's great to be here. Yeah, so Club of Rome, that's a long time ago, 1980s, I was at university, and there was all these predictions that things were going to go horribly wrong somewhere around now, and we kept saying if we don't do anything then it's going to be too late. Well, it nearly is too late now, but we're still going. But what I'm really aware of is that citizens have many pressures on their lives. They have very present problems around income, around social congestion in their communities, around coping with COVID now. There's all sorts of stuff that basically means that we discount the future hugely. We don't really know how to think about what our society is going to be like in the future. So what we do at Shared Future is use various techniques or processes to try and help everyday citizens really get to grips with these really complex and wicked problems like climate change or decarbonisation or retrofit. So we do them through a variety of techniques. The one I was really focusing on here is deliberative democracy. So that is recruiting people within a locality, could be a big locality, could be quite a small local area, and using a technique called sortition, where we recruit people at random, but we stratify that group of people so that they represent the diversity of everybody there. We don't work by recruiting activists, we work by recruiting ordinary citizens. We then take them through a process of understanding their lived experience, what they know about the topic, and then giving them expert commentators to give them new perspectives, and then go through a deliberation to the point where they make recommendations. And hopefully those recommendations then shape how policy goes forward on retrofit or just transitions or whatever it might be. The big hope also is that they then actually start to feel that they have agency through this process and voice, and can start actually becoming leaders in their own community, and deviate positively from what they were doing previously to become more engaged in this very tricky transition issue. The other thing we do, and my particular passion, is participatory budgeting, which is really a global practice around how you get people talking, coming up with ideas, turning those ideas into realizable projects, and then using some methodology like online voting or face-to-face voting to decide how to spend public money on things that matter to ordinary people. And it's been used in many different contexts, but I think it's got a huge resonance within the whole retrofit decarbonisation, where there's going to be a lot of money spent on things like the Green New Deal or on improving properties. But people are questioning, well, why spend that on that rather than on the things that are really pressing in my daily life now? So Lisbon's got a €5 million participatory budgeting, green participatory budgeting, I believe. Lots of different cities have used it, but we've not used it enough. So I'm just interested about how we create democratic spaces so that ordinary people who might otherwise feel that they don't really have confidence to engage with this process actually start to shape it, because unless they shape it, it's likely not to be socially just. It's likely to be led by the expectations of people with power and with agency, who are the best protected from the impacts of climate change. So if we're going to move to a socially just transition, we need to move to a socially just democracy as well.
Yes, that's a fantastic introduction. Thank you very much for sharing. And I'm sure, again, in the discussion, we might be able to dive into some of the specific work that you've done in Leeds and in other areas that it's covered in your presentation. Again, if people get time to see that in the video library. I'm particularly interested to sort of perhaps explore in a little bit more detail around this in your work, but in everybody's work around the shift to working online and how those processes have shifted in that way and some of the processes around that. Thank you. So next up, we're going to hear from Lauren Salmon, who's Monitoring and Evaluation Manager, who is joined by her colleague, Shane Donnellan, Senior Behaviour Change Specialist, both from Changeworks in the UK. They oversee the development and delivery of robust monitoring and evaluation for a range of internal and external projects, evidencing impact and providing critical insight to inform delivery of current and future projects and programmes by Changeworks and external clients. Examples have included 6 projects for the Scottish Government's Decarbonisation Fund. Lauren has a background in social research within the environmental sector and has worked with clients including the Scottish Government, charitable trusts, local authorities and housing associations. Once I've scrambled the words out of my mouth, I will hand over to you, Lauren and Shane. Thank you.
Danielle. So yes, I'm Shane, not Lauren, and we work for Changeworks, which is Scotland's largest environmental charity. So Changeworks works across fuel poverty, energy efficiency, and low carbon behaviours, and it's quite hands-on, kind of delivery focused. So the projects we're going to speak about today they're I suppose quite dynamic. They're just 3 examples of recent projects that have kind of overlapped a little bit in terms of the themes around decarbonisation and kind of a just transition. Some of the clients we work for, Scottish Government, Citizens Advice Scotland and local authorities and housing associations, this research is kind of as I say, an amalgamation of research by those 3. I'll pass over to Lauren now.
Yeah, I'll just touch on briefly a brief overview of what our presentation was about, and hopefully you've managed to catch it, but for those of you who didn't, we were sharing findings and recommendations from those recent research projects that Shane mentioned, and the main theme being how we can make the transition to decarbonisation fair for the most vulnerable members of our society. The key findings were that regardless of decarbonisation strategy and the approach taken, almost all of the results could result in additional costs or possible harm for vulnerable people if they aren't handled correctly, and a high proportion of the vulnerable groups we engaged in that research felt that all stages of the decarbonisation process were of concern to them. Our recommendations, 3 of the sort of overarching points were that we believe we need to raise awareness of the concerns of vulnerable people so that they're able to be better supported by the organisations that need to help them through that process. That support needs to be delivered cross-sectorally, and additional work done by key agencies to build trust amongst consumers, because we've highlighted some places where there is distrust, and also an improved consumer protection provision to address the gaps placing vulnerable consumers at risk through that retrofit process.
Great, thanks both. So some really excellent insights in that presentation again in relation to vulnerability and some of the things that I perhaps not given much thought to before around mis-selling and where some of those gaps in protection that we perhaps haven't paid attention to in the past, and again something that we might come back to in the discussion. Also sort of taking away within it that to make decarbonisation fair, a lot of work is required, and we can't really shy away from that. And also sort of moving forward, an expectation that there'll be much more people occupying some of those existing vulnerable groups, but also we may identify new groups that are considered vulnerable in other ways as a result of the current context and coming out of it. Thanks both. So moving on lastly to Maureen Cornelis, who is the Executive Director and Founder of Next Energy Consumer, a policy consultancy focused on the social aspects of the energy and climate transitions at European and international levels. Marine's work bridges the needs and experience of civil society, the scientific communities, the business and policymakers in the energy and climate transitions. Before Next Energy Consumer, Marine served as the Secretary General of NEON, the European Network of Energy Dispute Resolution Services, and Ombudsman in Brussels. For the past 12 years, she has been focusing her work on consumer protection and empowerment issues, and her commitment enabled Marine to be appointed one of the first ambassadors of the European Climate Pact. Thanks, over to you, Marine.
Yes, hello, and thank you so much, Danielle, for this introduction. Here I will talk about the ESRC Just Energy project. It's a project that has involved me and Naomi Tretzfeld from the University of Westminster and Chris Gill of the University of Glasgow for the past 3 years. And during this project, we have been focusing on why do people do not access ombudsman and formal sources of justice? Why do people don't know how to defend themselves? We found in the 6 countries that we studied that whatever their, well, especially when they were facing difficult circumstances, they didn't know where to turn to, which door they could knock, and who was here to help them. And we found that the local sector was having a very big impact in helping them bridge the needs with formal sources of justice, which are embodied in several countries by ombudsmen, alternative dispute resolution providers, or even regulators. Overall, we found that justice and ADR are progressing at a different pace than that of the most vulnerable. And indeed, cooperation and coordination of different actors is absolutely fundamental. Access to justice has to be taken as a fundamental angle in the overall decarbonization and energy right process. And it has to be way more straightforward. We can't really expect people to defend themselves if they don't know where to start. So our project is really at this crossroad between practice and theory. So the next steps will be to produce a toolkit that will benefit ombudsmen, ombudspeople, and regulators in order for them to know better how to approach vulnerable populations.
Thanks very much, Marine. That was a really good overview. So yeah, I'm going to sort of kick off with a question for myself to the panel, actually, and linking back to something I'd said to Des. Just to remind everybody, we've got some questions coming in now, but please do put any questions for our panelists in the Q&A section in Hoover, and they'll get handed over to me to pass on to our panelists. But to kick off with the question I wanted to ask was, in the presentations, all of you mentioned responses to COVID-19 and the ways we've had to shift our ways of working, or particular vulnerabilities that communities have experienced, or sort of the ways of working of local actors and local groups. So in terms of working with communities and vulnerable people in a local setting, I wanted to ask what techniques and methods do we think we want to keep, and which we see as continuing to be risky, and which we might want to lose and move away from going forward. So what are sort of some of the strengths of having to work the way we are now, and what are some of the risks that still exist there, and getting back to what was done before? I don't mind who wants to jump in first. I might ask Jez, because a bit of your presentation focused on the change of working.
Yeah, I mean, we have. So we were running a citizens jury process. So we do citizens juries, which tends to be smaller than citizens assemblies. We were running one when COVID hit, and immediately we had to suspend that. And it took a little while, and then we were able to put that online. So we completed that. That was the Lancaster Citizens Jury. We also ran the Kendal Town Council Citizens Jury through the autumn as well, fully online. We've now just completed the Warwick District Council Citizens Assembly on Climate Change. And we've just started the North of Tyne Citizens Assembly on Climate Change, all online. So it is possible to run deliberative processes, but what we found is it takes more resource and energy. you actually need to make sure that you don't create new digital divides. So we've had kind of weird situations where somebody's gone round to someone's house whose first time they've really tried to get online on Zoom or something like that, and standing outside the window because we can't go into, you know, break social distancing, and pointing and saying, that's the mouse, you know, that's the thing you use. So one of the big challenges in all processes is closing the language gap and the skills gap between people who have power and agency and those who don't, and not making assumptions. So we've been able to move them online, but I do think if you want to really move people's understanding and ownership of the issue forward, you need to work on emotional as well as technical or rational levels. And I don't think there's anything better than being in a room with a load of other people and seeing their bodily reactions and the physicality of learning. So I look forward to when we can hold our deliberative processes face to face again, because some information is good delivered online. If you've got a neurodiversity, for example, it can be really scary meeting. If you've got other forms of worry about mixing, it can be safer to do it online. But ultimately, if we want to affect deep change, we need to really connect on an emotional level.
Yeah, and I think even I've sort of felt that just from, you know, the experience of a conference where you're smiling and nodding and we can see one another's faces now, but you find that when you're in the sessions and you can't see everybody else, there is that thing missing. So that emotional element, that being able to connect and have that person in front of you. And yeah, very, very interesting. Thanks, Jess. Does anybody want to add to that in terms of working with communities in the work that they do? Marion?
Yes, I would add something about the work of Ombudsman with COVID. The thing is, overall, for the past years, the main topic of complaints has been invoicing. People tend to go to the Ombudsman when they have a problem with their energy bills. And with COVID, spending way more time at home has, of course, increased the energy bills. So the data are not complete yet. So it's really preliminary, and it's something that, I mean, something just that I saw from Ombuds colleagues. But I saw that, for instance, in Belgium, they had a 20% increase in the number of complaints they were receiving in 2020. 20% more than the previous year. So I don't have the details. Mm-hmm. I will be happy to share them when I have everything, but I think it's already quite, it really puts the finger of one of the big issue of accessing justice, and saying that energy is so essential, and it's really an essential right, especially in the time of COVID.
Yeah, brilliant. And I think we heard in the interactive session today, sorry, Irene, in the interactive session today, the map that's been produced by the engager of the responses at a European level to working with vulnerable people. And I think some of the build support and managing energy debts around that has been quite illuminating, where people are doing well, or suppliers maybe are doing well and others not so much. Irene, sorry, I jumped straight ahead of you there.
No, I was about to say that here, for example, when we had like at the first lockdown, we realized that most of the families didn't even have like appropriate devices to connect like to the online school, for example. So that creates a very, very high, like a large digital gap. And when everything turns online, the families like that wanted to complain about like same as Marine said, like energy bills, or wanted to have like the social bonus that we have like for electricity. The bureaucracy that normally it's very high, like it was enormous, because you have like to wait like for online documents that you have to fill in alone at home, and maybe they're not easy to, so it increased a lot. I think like this exclusion from like lots of people that don't feel included in the energy system.
Yeah, and Irene, sort of your presentation covered a lot of some of those overlapping vulnerabilities, and I guess this has brought into stark contrast some of those around digital exclusion and inclusion, and how that overlaps with other areas of access. Lauren and Shane, if you've got nothing to add on that, I'm going to one of the questions from our audience out. Okay, brilliant. So a question to all, but following on from a quote from Marine, in that the system needs to change to include access to energy justice. So a question to everybody, any thoughts on what should be the main changes in this confusopoly, the key word from yesterday, of the energy market? And that question comes from Caroline Porte-Valente. Shane, I think you're about to unmute.
Yeah, I'm happy to start the ball rolling on this one. I think undoubtedly the system needs to change, and with decarbonisation, I mean, the big question is who pays and whether people who are more vulnerable can afford to pay or reap the benefits of it. No one has the answers, because it kind of all comes back to finance. Governments don't want to pay. People can't, people don't want to foot the bill themselves. And there's some models, such as the Green Deal in the UK, which kind of fell flat on its face for various reasons, but was a reason that people could invest in decarbonisation without, and the debt was attached to the property rather than people paying. So I think everything needs to be on the table, but also innovative financing models, heat as a service, or comfort as a service rather, where you've got cooling as well. Everything needs to be on the table, and probably a combination of all different models going forward, like to achieve it at scale.
Brilliant, thanks Shane. So main changes to the energy market. Des, do you have any insights from your sessions that you might want to share from the citizens panels and juries?
I don't know if I can, but in terms of the changes in the energy market, I think people feel very disassociated from the energy producers. I think there was, and interestingly, we had one of the national grids sort of suppliers actually talking to us about whether we could make people understand more about the tunnel and the process. I think, we've had ideas about people forming local co-ops, buying co-ops and things coming forward, and it's been linked into some of those policies. So we've got kind of group buying schemes, and obviously people have been interested in kind of cooperative ways of working. I've been involved in other projects that's looked at the energy as a sort of community-owned energy in that sense. But I think the main problem is the lack of levers between ordinary citizens and the market. We've got this sort of disjunct, and there doesn't seem to be very many ways that people can affect the system. All they can do is make themselves more resilient in their own locality. So I think that's a challenge. How do we feed through the system so that injustice leads into action? And I think that's a big problem.
Maureen, did you want to add any perspectives on sort of energy market? So that's with kind of UK centric there, I think, on the broader context across Europe and beyond.
Yes, I think that one aspect that has to be taken into account is the idea of fairness, even fairness by design. I mean, it really corresponds to what's just said earlier, that if you don't really engage people into like alternative forms of democracy or direct participation processes, they might not be heard, or the policies won't be as tailored to their needs as they should be. And indeed, I mean, I think that in Europe, we, at least at EU level, we have been shifting from a very technical point of view, and then parties involved with consumer correcting what was missing to taking better into account the needs of the people. So I think this is absolutely the way forward, and taking into account the different needs and priorities, and the fact that not everybody can and is willing to, or has the same interest in engaging with the energy, is absolutely fundamental. And I mean, when saying energy, I'm also implying also all relative energy rights and access to what is linked to energy indeed.
Yeah, and sort of wider utilities, I guess, as well in relation. Thanks, Marion. Irene, I just wanted to kind of pull in on that around energy markets and think about the case in La Canada Real, and where the markets and the system has failed quite a significant number of families and people, and led to this, what you talk about in your presentation, around criminalisation discourses, and it kind of had some resonance in UK work around benefit recipients and that criminalisation there, and understanding that from the other side where there's sort of been system or market failures. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on main changes that are required to the markets and systems around the people that you were dealing with in Barcelona.
Yeah, I think that La Cañada Real, it's really like a very, very like, the worst experience that I have seen, at least in Spain, because you have like a lot of migrant families that are like totally, they don't have energy supplies since like 6 months. We had like those storms that I know that Spain doesn't have like the worst winter ever, but still it was cold. So it's a very, very complicated situation because it's an informal settlement, but still I think that we are very used to assume that energy is something that everybody should pay for, and that we should only get it as long as you can pay for it. And I think that that's like, for me, like it's the origin of like the original question, that it really has to be like that, because energy can be treated as a common also, but it's not. It's treated like as a profit commodity. So all the people that are in an energy exclusion situation are there because they cannot afford energy the way it is served now by the big utilities, at least here in Spain. So I think that, and linking to the previous question, for me the answer is energy democracy. And I know that it's a very common used word, but if you don't, you're not able to like localize more and to see, to track production with distribution with the suppliers, then you lose this energy democracy, and you can only see the last, like the pay for it process, that is the last one. And I think that the only way, for example, there has been a very strong discourse on energy efficiency here, like some years ago, that people that cannot afford energy, they should spend less and they should have less energy services. And that's very dangerous, because that criminalizes family, because they use too much energy, because they want to, as people that have irregular connections. Here you cannot have a regular connection if you have not a bill contract or you don't own the house. So you have to, there's lots of families that have to have irregular connections so that they can have energy. And most of the discourse of people that are stealing energy, and they steal from who? I mean, and those questions, we never ask for those questions. We always, the main discourse is that people steal energy, or they want energy for free because they don't want to do anything. And that's the criminalizing discourses that also afterwards, when you ask those people get engaged in energy market, they won't get engaged in a market that criminalizes them. So I think that there's a very important thing to solve.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm going to turn, specifically got a question for ChangeWorks now from John Rowlett, asking, with historical evidence of SMEs abusing the funding system in the Green Deal Home Improvement Fund and recently the Green Homes Grant scheme, do you think there is an argument for greater regulatory enforcement, both in delivery practices, pricing and end user engagement, to build trust in the retrofit programme?
Yeah, so we've seen some pretty significant problems with SMEs taking advantage of the system, as John's mentioned there in his question. And in particular, I think there was a big outrageous incident of a company called Helms, I think, causing a lot of problems for customers in the UK who are participating in the Green Deal scheme, which led to them not being able to get insurance for their homes or mortgages, which was quite a dramatic sort of impact. And a lot of those issues are still trying to be resolved now. You know, there's cross-parliamentary groups trying to deal with these issues for the people that have been victimized, I suppose, as a result of that activity. So we did a piece of research which we mentioned in our presentation for Citizens Advice Scotland, around kind of a review of the consumer protection process for retrofit in Scotland. And yeah, though it sort of showed that there are still pretty significant gaps and potholes in the policy protections in place for consumers going through that process. In particular, sort of a little bit of a two-tiered approach, a two-tiered system in that if you're entering this through like a set government scheme, such as home energy efficiency programmes for Scotland, the area-based schemes that are done by the local authorities, there's much better sort of vetting and processes in place to protect consumers there, versus if you're just an independent householder wanting to access the market. So yeah, there really needs to be a bit of an overhaul of the whole system, looking at it holistically as opposed to just people accessing it through certain touch points and routes. Yeah, in particular things like not enough checks being done on these companies, and then also when a company is identified as having repeatedly caused harm to consumers, not enough sort of quick effort to get them off kind of reputable lists and remove them. So a whole host of things that could be improved, yeah, to really help those consumers.
So I'm aware in the literature and sort of past work around this sort of fly by the night cowboy schemes in and out in UK context, and I know that in your presentation you briefly touched on sort of some archetypes and who is particularly vulnerable in these circumstances. So I just wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit more in terms of the tiered risks.
Yeah, Shane, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, okay. So yeah, the archetypes came from some research by the Scottish Government. They're kind of they've developed 8 consumer archetypes that broadly, segments the Scottish population based on income, kind of age. So just off the top of my head, wealthy rural families is one. Very low income single parents is another archetype, and and so say the latter, they're maybe more likely to be in urban locations. And so we looked at the various these 8 archetypes and used them in another piece of research to kind of identify the impacts of decarbonisation. Whatever decarbonisation looks like, whether it's heat pumps or hybrid heat pumps or biomass, and kind of all roads just led to the disadvantaged being further disadvantaged, or at least the potential for that to happen. But there's also huge gaps. I mean, and it's kind of the outcome that you're like, you kind of expect, but there is huge gaps in the literature. There's loads of things that haven't been done. Now, we were looking at predominantly Scottish context and then wider UK, but there's, again, costs are huge, and whether it's capital costs or maintenance, but people who are likely to be disadvantaged are likely to be further disadvantaged. And kind of, some people who, through our research, like speaking to people with disabilities or long-term health conditions, they don't even expect to be engaged with. They're kind of some of the messages that have been coming back is that, it's just trying to get by. Whatever's happening kind of happens to them rather than them being active participants. I suppose it links a lot to what Jez was speaking about.
Brilliant, thanks, Shane. And I think sort of underlining a lot of that is, and coming out of this session and a number of the other sessions, is that how much time and effort and commitment needs to be there to building trust and gaining trust and establishing that in communities, but how that can be knocked down in a second, and the coming back from that and the ramifications of that are quite significant. Marion, were you about to unmute to add to that, or?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking about what Irene said earlier about the energy sector, but I think it applies also to retrofitting, etc. I feel that very often people who are having a hard time paying their bills are judged guilty before even having started to defend themselves. So sometimes the energy companies act as if they were guilty, if the error or the fault was entirely on their shoulders, on the people's shoulders, and not a systemic problem or an issue that was coming from other parties. So I think that this inherent, indeed the problem in La Cañada Real really embodies what is everything that is wrong in the system. Yeah, in the energy sector, as in for all sectors, when you are vulnerable, it's not a reason to be considered guilty beforehand. You are innocent until you are proven otherwise.
Yeah, some really clear links there about, you know, the starting position of the householder or the vulnerable individual being that they start from a position of defending, whereas actually much of this work is around access and justice and fairness. Yes, your hand went up, but Irene, were you about to unmute before to respond to Marine?
I was about to say, from what Marine said, and a question that I saw in the chat, like the concept of vulnerable consumer, I like it very much. And I think, if I'm wrong, excuse me very much, but I think it's the Scottish energy poverty strategy that says that we shouldn't consider vulnerable those who cannot pay, but those who are like vulnerable in terms of health or in terms of a major need of energy services. And I think that's very interesting because you shift the burden from like the paying thing to the health and energy as a right. So and I think that then you cannot play guilty people that don't pay, because people need energy for their healthy life. So I think that's like the most interesting like policy in terms of vulnerable consideration that I have recently seen.
So yeah, I'm gonna slot over to Jez now, but I'm gonna just quickly dive in with to untangle something Irene talked about there about in reference to vulnerable consumers and when we're calling them vulnerable consumers. So in the work that you do and the groups that you work with, what concepts and terms do you use? You know, is energy poverty in the everyday language that you're referring to? What sort of vulnerable terms and concepts are we using to refer to these groups? Jez,
yeah, I wanted to come in with another approach, which might be around precariousness. So I'm always get worried when people say vulnerable. People then make assumptions about what that means. But there's some really interesting stuff that comes from sustainable livelihoods analysis, which looks at things like social gifting in relation to money. So the people often who are most precarious in our society are not the people who are unemployed or who have, time in order to build social networks and trust and gifting with other people in very impoverished situations, cash poor situations. It's the ones who are working in very low paid jobs, just about managing, don't have the time in order to put into social gifting, childcare sharing, things like that. Then they may have a problem. Their cooker breaks. They can't afford a new cooker. They then can't, cook meals for their children. Then they have to go and buy them from takeaways. That costs, and it becomes a cycle. So I think it's also important in this area to think about who is feeling precarious about their ability to pay, and what rational decisions might there be to do things like steal energy or do things which the market system would seem to be perverse. So I think we need to think more deeply about what is exclusion and precariousness in a market-driven society.
Brilliant, thanks, Jez. And that speaks quite nicely to sort of lots of debate around not thinking about energy poverty or energy vulnerability as a binary, what you are one or the other, and that actually it's this fluidity and flexibility, and actually a lot of people will sit on the edges of that and move to a more or less vulnerable situation on dependent on a number of different circumstances and factors. Brilliant. So I've got a question for everybody now, kind of linked to the last part around thinking around terminology and how we talk about making decarbonisation fair for certain communities and vulnerable groups. It comes from Amy, I believe. So what is the difference between vulnerable and hard to reach consumers? And are they the same people, or do they require different approaches in terms of engagement and support?
If I could go there, I think there's both overlap but there's also very different, and it chimes with kind of what Jez was talking about in your previous comment about the language used. A lot of vulnerable people don't identify as being vulnerable, but they'll identify as having long-term health conditions, or single parents, for example, is a vulnerability, you know, and it is likely to be linked with a lower income household, but it doesn't show up on a lot of radars, I suppose. It depends how you slice and dice vulnerability. So there's always going to be vulnerability, but some people talk about, you know, and so hard to reach, hard to treat, vulnerable. They all overlap, but there's kind of no, the Venn diagram isn't a circle. Some people will be in some groups, but not others. And similarly with fuel poverty, you know, we tend to talk about fuel poverty, and you know, people are aware of the different drivers of fuel poverty, whereas an individual householder will talk about the meter being cut off, or energy debt. You know, energy debt, which is a tangible concept, as opposed to fuel poverty, which, as you say, Danielle, is a bit more kind of flowy. And you know, so even looking at things, looking at energy debt as opposed to fuel poverty throws up a whole different raft of kind of issues and geographical spread, and you know, fear and guilt and shame, that, you know, some of the psychosocial factors that come into it that are maybe less evident with fuel poverty, which is seen as a slightly more systemic thing. So it's a bit of a tangent there, but
yeah, that's great. Thank you, Shane. Lauren, I think you came off mute at the flash of light there. So
yeah, sorry.
no,
sorry.
Sorry.
I was a bit distracted then. My cat was trying to jump on the desk. She's been extracted now. So yeah, as Shane was saying, we're actually currently doing a piece for the Energy Consumers Commission around the Priority Services Register in Scotland, and that's designed to support vulnerable consumers with a range of different things, from like billing to what to do in the case of a power cut. And we're looking at whether that could be used potentially as a indication or a mechanism to support people in a situation where they're going through a decarbonisation process, to flag them as supposedly as being vulnerable, so to speak. But I think it's really clear from what we've been looking at there, as Shane's kind of mentioned a little bit there, in terms of what is vulnerable is a little bit kind of, it can be quite transient. In particular, in cases of, you know, people suffering a bereavement, you know, maybe they have reduced capacity to handle the situation that they're in, and that could just be that they've suddenly got a bit behind on the bills slightly, and yet then that kind of pushes them into a position of debt where they're struggling to get out of that. A lot of, as well, around mental health and people not getting extra support, with, yeah, and that not being recognised as a mechanism for extra support. I think the question from Amy mentioned that what's that kind of hard to reach, and I think that's quite a difficult one to answer, really, in terms of it, in that it could depend on what the scenario is in terms of what makes them hard to reach. I suppose in terms of engaging with consumers, it can be quite challenging, especially now with the sort of people who aren't digitally literate or don't have access to the internet, and they potentially could miss out as a result of that, because a lot of schemes have started to go more and more online. You know, the rise of kind of social media advertising, it's very cheap, and people accessing different deals that way. We deliver a lot of the home energy efficiency programs for Scotland, insulation schemes, which I know our marketing team have to kind of put into quite a lot of effort to ensure that they're able to reach people in a lot of different ways, such as kind of putting banners up in the community, because, you know, some people might not engage with a letter through the door or an email. So, yeah.
Thanks, Lauren. I just following on from that thread, I wanted to go to Marion and then Irene, actually. So Marion, you obviously, and it's a shameless plug here for the book that's coming out of the project and that you've spent the last few years working on, which is noted in the presentation if people want to hear more. But the book has in its title Vulnerable Consumers. So I just wondered if you could unpick from the point of that project how you're approaching vulnerability, or how the project team are approaching vulnerability.
Yes, so indeed we are approaching the term energy poverty and the term vulnerability also, because in many countries there is no real acknowledgement of the hard to reach as such, in the sense that, oh, okay, they are hard to reach, and so what? And there is this whole policy angle that is kind of, and research angle that is probably missing. I mean, just to give you an example, in Italy, about only 1/3 of the potential beneficiary of a social bonus to reduce their energy bills are actually receiving it. And it has taken many years for the regulator to say, okay, let's make it automatic. But now, between you and I, they are having problem with the data privacy authority in order to make it automatic. So when you don't acknowledge this phenomenon, actually it's not visible. It's totally out of concept. So we took the idea of vulnerability because we thought that it was more kind of more broad, it would include the different circumstances of everyone, and it was going also beyond the pure energy sector. I've been working in the energy sector for the past 12 years, but my colleagues Naomi and Chris have not. They have been dealing with ADR, alternative dispute resolution, or people not having access to justice in general, and not only in the energy sector. So I would say that I don't really have the precise answer to this question, but I would say that it comes from also this kind of mixed background of the whole research team, that we felt that it was more appropriate for our book to be about vulnerability, and yeah, the book will be released at the end of July.
Thanks, Marion. Yeah, I think kind of in all of the discussions I've sat in so far on the panels, sort of the stickiness around how we approach vulnerability and when it has a strength and when it's maybe not as appropriate has kind of been covered off in a lot of the discussions. And actually on that, I just wanted to kind of flag up with Irene, because again, in your presentation, you talk about the workshops with the children who had done the work to the UN, is it, if I'm correct, around becoming more empowered citizens and more empowered actors in their situation. But we would kind of automatically consider children as vulnerable in this context, and they were kind of pushing back on that in some of the ways in which you described their involvement. And I just wondered if you had any thoughts around younger actors in the wider conversations, and those that we might consider automatically vulnerable but actually are taking quite a different stand.
In terms of this children agency and vulnerability, I think that it's very important, at least for us who did the research, that when you put both together, then you give really people a voice. Because if you only talk about vulnerability in some groups of population, then you kind of I don't know if the words are correct in English, but you kind of consider you're looking down to someone because he doesn't have the capabilities to do something. But when you put together, so they are in a precarious situation. I liked very much the precarity concept, because it doesn't give people responsibility for their situation, which they haven't. So it's like when you're in a precarity situation, you can also have you should have agency in changing this situation. Then you can, in terms of children, we have seen it a lot in the climate movements. When you give young people a voice, or when they claim for their voices, because they're not usually given, but they claim for them, then you achieve, they're like young people are vulnerable to climate change because there's the next generation and they're going to suffer it. But as they stand for their rights and they have agency, they can change the situation. When you talk about children in terms of school attainment or in terms of security or mental health, and they're affected by energy precarity, it's true they are affected, but no one asks them how would they feel, what do they feel, how would they do. And I think that's very, very important, because then you can get new policies, because you can get like fresh views on the policies. And with children, it's a very particular case, because they don't usually have agency, because they depend on their families. And we always consider them in a family, but not as as children, as an active political subject. And in La Cañada Real, precisely, in order to combat all these criminalizing discourses, they put children in the first line, and children did lots of drawing and addressed letters to the United Nations and appeared in a lot of like newspapers, and they managed to change like this criminalization to a rights discourse because children spoke out about their situation. So I think that it's very interesting when not only to try to define vulnerability and who's vulnerable, but to try to ask ourselves, how do we give spaces to transform vulnerability into agency?
That's brilliant, Irene. Thank you ever so much. I think I could ask you a dozen more questions about these workshops with children as a sort of overlooked voice and a real overlooked power. I'm going to move on to the next question now. I didn't see anybody sort of trying to come off mute quickly. The next question is one for Marine that's getting a few votes on Hoover. And it comes from Jose Carlos de los Riscos Hidalgo. They ask, do you think that you should implement an automatic vital minimum energy consumption in the household, considering different models according to variables such as income, climate, energy efficiency of the house in each country?
I think it's probably a very good idea, and I will invite you to come to the following Engager conference in a couple of weeks on the right to energy, because it's really about that we are talking. So go to the Engager website, Engager Energy website, and you will have probably a lot of answers to that question.
Brilliant, thanks, Maureen. And I'm almost certain that furiously in the background now, the brilliant event coordinators will be sharing details of that somewhere for those in the session now. And if not, we'll make sure we do so afterwards. Question for everybody now. So thank you from Flavia de Cavallo. Apologies for my pronunciation. Thank you for all the presentations. They would like to know how the government should act with the householders that have irregular connections, because in many places, those who pay for energy is the regular householders, but how the agents could act to be more efficient to solve problems of irregular energy connections. What kind of new policies could decrease this problem and intensify social inclusion? Around irregular connections and supply to energy, which I think touches a little bit on what Irene was talking about before.
Jess, if you want to start.
Well, I just wanted to know really clarity what irregular means. Does that mean that people don't have constant supply of power, or does it mean that they are operating outside the market, that they're doing something illegal in some way? So I was just clarifying that term.
So I will await to see if further commentary comes into the Q&A. Irene, did you have something to add initially?
At least here, it means when we talk about irregular connections, normally we refer to people because people that, you know, that everyone has, and in every country there is, but in Spain there is also a huge housing issue, and there's really complicated to have to afford a normal house. So there's a lot of more and more precarious families that are occupying empty houses, and there's when they get to have this bank house, this house that has a bank as an owner or a big utility, a big company as an owner, then the energy utilities, they won't allow them to have regular connections. They say, if you don't have the bail or you don't have the property, I cannot connect you, which we think it's a bit outrageous because it's not their problem. They're not legislators, so you just give them your product because it's what you consider energy, and it's not your problem if they have or don't this regular possession, but still they do. So there's a lot of families that actually want to have a regular supply. They want to pay for their bills, but they cannot because the big utility won't let them. So in our case, what we ask for is that the government enables people to have a regular connection because they are really willing to pay and they cannot. But also, someone said also, we also think that there should be this discussion around the minimum supply, energy supply that allows everyone to have a minimum regular connection. And because we don't have in Spain, for example, prepayment meters. That's the other like big discussion. So we have like or regular supplies or people that cannot pay but still want to access energy, and they get connected to the net. Even they do something that it's illegal, but we don't like to use illegal because it's like legitimate in some cases. So we also have there like along this, and we would say like governments should allow them or enable them to have regular supplies because it's a very important security thing.
Right. I wondered if any thoughts, I'm looking at Shane and Lauren, but not necessarily specifically so, but I'm thinking sort of rural and remote communities and regular connections and policies that might need to be targeted towards regular connections or reliable connections in that sense. Do you have any thoughts or reflections? Purely because of the Scottish perspective is why I'm looking at you both.
Yeah, I think it's fairly safe to say this is not so much of a problem in the UK in terms of the actual people getting connections to the electricity supply in their homes. But I suppose my first thought when I saw the question about the irregular energy connections was that in a lot of parts of Scotland, particularly remote rural areas, we get all sorts of obscure metering arrangements. So really random setups where there's multiple different tariffs and certain types of appliances can be connected to certain rates. We not long ago did a piece on specifically focusing on a tariff called Total Heat, Total Control, THTC. We found that people are kind of quite often feeling quite stuck on that as a metering arrangement, and to get off it, they quite often would have to change the metering, and that can also cause quite a few problems in terms of the switch at the moment to smart meters and access of that smart meter connection to these remote rural areas. So people are finding themselves in quite a monopoly, and these tariffs were quite often originally set up as a way to provide cheaper heat for people on electricity tariffs with electric heating setups in their home. But over time, with the kind of increasing green kind of levies on the electricity tariff, the prices have crept up and up, and they've become increasingly affordable, but people aren't really getting the message, you know, that's compared to possibly even a standard tariff arrangement, never mind kind of other alternatives such as Economy 7, you know, they could be saving quite a bit of money if they are able to switch to a different system.
Thanks, Lauren. Shane, did you have anything to add, or are you? That's right.
Not hugely, other than I suppose just aside from the tariffs, there's a lot of people who aren't on gas, so their debt is very different if they're working with biomass or LPG or oil, and there can be a lot of complexities. Often there isn't energy debt, but there is fuel poverty, because a fill of oil costs, you know, £500 a year, as opposed to being able to pay by direct debit or kind of regularly. So there are a lot of people who experience things that way. So it kind of ties in a slightly different angle.
Great, thanks. Sorry guys, I did sort of throw that on the spot there. Yes, I've got a follow-up from Flavia on the irregular connection being the energy. So I think the consumer, a really common issue in Brazil, the fee for energy when connected directly to the grid, so not paying for energy. So I don't know if that provides more clarity for you. Yeah.
Well, it does, I suppose, because a very long time ago I was a squatter and I bypassed the electricity meter, so I've understood this concept. But more particularly, I think I'd like to focus on something which is about the intersection of different injustices. And one of our problems is that we focus on our particular thing, which is in this case fuel poverty or energy transition. But actually, we're not looking at the holistic life of the individual. And I think you've seen in, say, the Black Lives Matter movements in America, where people are identifying that there are multiple barriers to them acting as good citizens, getting regular connections, moving on to tariffs. Lots of people have very chaotic and messy lives. and it's really hard to navigate this system to actually get the best deals. Lots of people want to be on prepaid tariffs, which are much higher, because it gives them a sense of control in one area of their life when they know that they can't afford to have a bill every quarter and not know how to find a large lump of cash at some point in some scary future. So I think it's really important, if we're going to tackle this in one zone, we have to start with the individual's lives and look at the totality of the barriers they're facing. And I just wanted to pick up on that phrase I think Maureen said about the hard to reach. I think we should move towards the easy to ignore as a different way of thinking about this, and how we really cope with people living in the grey economies of our lives, and what that means for when we try and bring a policy forward. We've got to start with what the lived experiences of real people, if we're going to bring everybody along, because otherwise we're going to leave some people further behind.
Brilliant, thank you, Jez. Maureen.
Yes, I think we indeed have to look into personal experiences, but we also have to look into systemic issues. I mean, certain neighborhoods are absolutely outlaws, and it's not because of the individuals. It's not their responsibility. It's way beyond. It's non-acknowledgement of the problem. It's being blind to a problem, just as I said earlier about the hard to reach, or what Jez said, wrapped up really nicely as easy to ignore. And it's so easy to ignore systemic problems and systemic injustices, indeed.
So we had Confusopoly yesterday and easy to ignore today. I'm curious to know what term's going to come out of the Making Decarbonisation Fair conference tomorrow. So I've got, sorry Jez, I know you've barely had a break in between answering. I've got a question specifically come for you. So given the time-consuming democratic process of citizen assembly and citizens' juries, how can we encourage vulnerable, precarious citizens to join and voice their problems? From Min to Nguyen. Apologies for pronunciation again.
That's all right. I mean, the simple answer is we pay people. We incentivize them to come to our processes. Well, we don't pay them, the commissioner pays them. We pay them in shopping vouchers, which they can spend in multiple different places. There are some issues around that because some people are worried some of the employment benefit laws will mean that those are seen as some sort of income, so we have to be careful. But fundamentally, we pay above the minimum wage for people's time on the basis that that time for when you are poor is more valuable than when you are rich. And we really often in our processes don't count professional time into the cost of these things. So we might, you know, there's all of us, some of us are being paid to be here. There's a cost to just our participation that we never factor in. So why don't we factor in the cost of the participation of the poor? So we pay people fundamentally because that's the socially just thing to do if we're asking them to give up their time to our processes.
I think there's a lesson there for research as well, which by and large does meet it as well. But again, asking for people's time, and I think really a nice summary there of, you know, that when poor people's time is even more valuable because of the pressures around them. Yeah, brilliant. Maureen, did I see, were you about to unmute, or? It's trying to read people's body language, I think, in a Zoom setting of who's about to speak. So I've got one more question for everybody from the audience. Do you think that prepaid smart meters could be a good solution for disconnections together with a free minimum living supply? And that question comes from Roberto Barella. So
I can start if you want. We don't have them, but we are highly, I mean, we don't want to have them either. I mean, we are trying not to have them, even though there has been like some tests in some neighborhoods in Spain to, we think that if energy is a right, it's the same right. So you don't have to have like a more expensive energy supply, or you don't have like to have a different energy access because you cannot pay the regular one. I mean, that's criminalizing people. And even if you get to the possibility that you can disconnect yourself and you cannot even claim someone for this connection, I mean, you do it to yourself because you have to stop consuming because you run out of money this week. I mean, for us, that's not the right perspective. So everything that is in the path to commodification or energy for profit, we tend to avoid them, and we think that the things that are right, it's a right when you can, it has disponibility. Like you don't have like to ask for it all the time, and you don't have like to adapt this right to your possibility to pay. So for us, like the prepayment meters might be the solution for the suppliers and might be the cheapest solution for the public for budgets, but are not a rights-based solution for people. That's what I think, at least.
Lauren and Shane, in the sorry, Marion, if you want to.
Yes, indeed, it can be the solution for the supplier or even for social workers, because, you know, it's a way to put the burden on the household, because, I mean, for social workers, it can be a way to teach people how to use energy or what their consumptions are. But overall, it's, I mean, at least in Belgium, in Wallonia, it's seen very often as some form of punishment. I mean, you've not been able to pay your bills, so you get this kind of prepaid meter. And at the end of the week, if you can't pay more, then that's your problem. So that's extremely cruel. That's a very cruel policy.
Yeah,
I was going to ask Lauren and Shane, because I know that in the UK context, there's a real drive around smart prepay at the moment. So I wondered if there was some reflections on that.
Yeah, I think Lauren may know more from the consumer protection side, but there's a strange kind of phenomenon around prepaid meters in the UK where I suppose it's the metering equivalent of Stockholm syndrome, where people who are on prepayment meters pay more, but people are happier with them because it means that they're on top of their out.
Oh, we might have lost Shane there. I'll try and carry on. Try and read his mind. Yeah, I think what Shane's trying to say is that people. Oh, sorry. Go on, Shane. You're back. You carry on. We lost you there. People are more on top of, you said, and then you dropped out.
Oh yeah, the people can manage their bills, but it's interesting that they're seen as a solution, because here in the UK they're kind of intertwined with issues, and people on prepayment meters are far more likely to be in fuel poverty, energy debt, all the kind of associated problems. The free minimum living supply is a kind of a nice counterpoint, but I don't think one that's been discussed in the UK, and certainly without that, prepayment meters I don't think are the answer. I don't know, Lauren, have you anything to add to that?
No, I don't particularly. I think the smart meter aspect of it, I don't think it's really going to change much for the prepay market. You know, I suppose the benefit for people on smart meters is that, you know, that meter reading's happening live, so that they're actually being billed more fairly, as in for what they're paying for at that moment in time. But that doesn't really kind of have a massive implication, I don't feel, for the prepay market. So.
Yes, it does.
I've always get worried when a technological solution to an individual problem is promoted, because there's going to be a lot of investment in this technology to solve a problem which is basically one which should be one of universality. You know, so we've got moves for universal basic income. Why not have similar moves towards universal kind of energy supply in that sense at a living level? So I think that's reasonable. One of the things I think that's also from my participatory budgeting area is how we discount the costs of not doing this. So we know that if an old person gets hypothermia or ill because they can't afford their energy bill, they go into a hospital, it costs £1,000 a week to provide for somebody in hospital. So we're prepared to spend large amounts of money in the wrong part of the system, but not invest that money on prevention. So again, how do we start to look at the full societal costs of fuel poverty or the just transition, rather than see it on an individualized basis? I can see that it goes against what you might call a kind of neoliberal mindset, that we shouldn't give people the release from the incentives of paying for things because we think they're going to just like waste it and be bad citizens. But I think that's profoundly insulting to people who are trying to manage within a complicated world and are fundamentally not the polluters that are causing the massive carbon problem that we have in the globe. The poor are the ones who are the least damaging to our environment, yet we're the ones that are victimizing them through regulation.
Brilliant. And just going to add to a comment from William Baker. In the UK, there are discussions on eliminating so-called self-disconnections by prepayment meter customers. So the Right to Energy calls for a ban on disconnections, and he suggests that this makes clear self-disconnections are banned in whatever mechanism needs to be put in place for that as well. Just sticking with some of the restrictions, I just wanted to kind of go back to Maureen and a brief point, and conscious of time because we are drawing to the close of this session. But Maureen, you talked about a significant amount of the issues being dealt with by the Ombudsman is around energy debt and energy billing and issues of that. And I wanted to ask, in any of the work across the project around, so we've talked a lot about the criminalisation narratives attached to householders and individuals, but to what extent have some of those issues around energy debts and energy billing been identified as wrongful on the part of the suppliers and the companies? And does the criminalisation narrative ever fall at the other end? Yeah, and I wondered if you had any experience of that across the project.
Yeah, that's absolutely why we think that the Ombudsman has to act as the middleman, as the neutral party who's able to say that there is a problem and the problem can be solved, and it's not necessarily the supplier's fault or the consumer fault. It can be anything. Sometimes the problem also arises from the distributor or the distributing company. So, you know, it's a whole set of actors that very often talk in a very aggressive way, because machine talk to machines, and a lot of I don't know, invoices are sent automatically without anybody involved in the process. Or so it's very much about putting human being back into the whole mechanical energy process, if you see what I mean. I think that human beings are the missing links, and sometimes talking really reasonably between the different parties really enable to find a solution. And it's something that I saw just this afternoon again. I was reading some jurisprudence from the French ombudsman, energy ombudsman, which explained that a supplier did agree to something with the ombudsman, but the distributor didn't agree, and the family who was complaining first was ending paying thousands of euros, and then after the ombudsman they had to go to a judge, which actually followed the decision from the ombudsman. But you know, ombudsmen in general don't have coercive powers, so they can't constrain the parties to agree on something. It's about finding a compromise. So so this is important, the importance of building a system where all parties talk to each other, but you can do it only if there are trust between the parties. So that means human beings and not only machines and automatic processes.
That's great. Thanks, Maureen. So Hoover's quite abrupt in kicking us off at the end of the session. So I kind of want to start to bring us to a close with one final round. We've got a final comment from Amy saying that she agrees with Jez. The poor are not the polluters, so why do we still target them with the demand reduction measures and ignore the high consumers? Which I think is a thread that will follow through into tomorrow, and has definitely been picked up on in other discussions across the 3 days. I want to just do a really sort of quick fire to all speakers in the last few minutes that we've got. So this session is focused on decarbonisation, fairness, energy poverty. We've talked about engagement and agency and empowering individuals and householders and different groups, and ultimately focusing on working with communities and vulnerable groups, however we might define them. So I just wondered if we could fly round everybody and just sort of ask, what would be your one big ask going forward in terms of working with communities and vulnerable groups? What would you like to see happen next? And who do I not want to give any thinking time to? Irene looks ready.
Okay, I think that the system is so perverted right now that I would have lots of big asks to do. But I think that one that Jess also said, that we should go more into the lived experiences, because if not, we dehumanize the problem. And I think that we have one of the women that comes to the Alliance Against Energy Poverty. She goes everywhere in her house with a lamp, because she is afraid of turning on the lights, because she's afraid of spending too much. She's afraid of being harassed by the company, and she's afraid of having a bill that she cannot pay and that she would like to pay. So I think that what I would ask is to really start working on less criminalizing discourses and on less insulting, as Jess said, also discourses towards people that for one reason or another cannot meet the bills, cannot pay, or cannot be in what we assume or what the system assumes that be joining the energy market. And I would ask that those people were the first ones to meet a fair transition and not the last ones. I mean, just keep them into the transition.
Thanks, Irene. Jess, can I come to you next? What's your one ask?
One of the things I've come across recently talking about deliberative democracy is this concept of legitimate coercion, which sounds fairly horrible, but what it basically means is, how do we create the structure within our democracy so that we can legitimately coerce behavior change? And I'm not talking about behavior change on individuals, but I'm talking about behavior change on corporations and those big polluters who are not paying. So how do we build trust and agency in our communities, in our societies, so that we can really start to tackle the big problems rather than always try and pick off the weakest and the most vulnerable and point fingers at them? So how do we move towards power going the other way, not from the grids to people's homes, but from people's homes to the grids in terms of democracy?
That's great. Thanks. Shane, can I come to you? You're nodding.
Yeah, no, completely agree with Jez. I think the fuel poverty and energy issues and energy poverty, they've been around forever. Decarbonisation, it's heralded as a brave new world. It's a transition. It's a fresh start. The fact that we're having this conference, fuel poverty is rampant throughout Europe. There's an opportunity to change things, but there needs to be regulation or some top-down intervention, not at the householder level, at the companies, at the suppliers, the people who are, or the organizations that are, capitalizing on people being unable to pay, and debt management and just consumer protections. Talking about it and hoping for goodwill isn't going to build robust frameworks that are looking after people. So there needs to be, I think, intervention.
Great, we've got just over a minute left, I think. So Lauren?
Keep it brief, yeah. And I think, we're on the cusp of some significant undertaking of retrofit that needs to be done to help us meet our climate change targets in the UK. But I think there needs to be a real sort of sit down and think by the powers that be before we start this process to ensure that those who are most vulnerable in our society are not placed at risk of exploitation or even being treated as guinea pigs, in this process, and that they get the support that they need so that they're able to benefit and aren't punished as a result of that process.
Great, Marianne, lastly, thank you, Lauren.
it's really hard after everything interesting that has been said, but I think that what is needed is for all parties to agree that other positions or other point of view are absolutely legitimate, and that everybody has something interesting, important, or relevant to say at a certain moment, and their voices have to be completely respected. Yeah, maybe more respect between the parties. That would be my pledge.
That's brilliant. Thanks ever so much. So yeah, I'm going to bring that to a close, but thank you all. I've really enjoyed the last 90 minutes of that discussion. So thank you all for your contributions, and to those joining in from beyond the screen for your questions and your comments. So thanks to the speakers, thanks to the audience, questions and comments. Encourage people once again to go to the video gallery to check out the videos from this session and the others, to continue engaging. I think we heard today that the conference platform will stay open for 6 months. We're all on Twitter as well, if that's where you share some thoughts and ideas as well. But the conference platform is there for community discussion as well. And we'll see you all tomorrow for the very last day, kicking off at 9 with the welcome, and at 9:30 for our 5th panel session, which looks at the challenges, the approaches and challenges to decarbonisation. So one last time, thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.